I'm Rose Skeeters, host of From Borderline to Beautiful, a show about hope and recovery from BPD.
Can't change the past when it's tomorrow. Yeah. You can't change the past when it's tomorrow. Yeah. There was a time when the slate was clear. No sins or remorse piled up year by year. I was on a nice list. There wasn't a chance I'd miss. Maybe should have passed on chasing every wish. No, knowing this. Yeah.
Hello and welcome to another episode of From Borderline to Beautiful. I'm your host, Rose Skeeters, and today I have a special guest with me. This is Bob Drozek. Welcome, Bob.
Hi, yeah, nice to see you, and thanks for having me, Rose.
Yeah, I'm just so excited to have Bob with us here on the podcast. Bob is the clinical director of the Mentalization-Based Treatment Center or Clinic at McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. He is also a teaching associate in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, specializing in the treatment of borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. He is also the author of the new book, Mentalization, Utilizing Reflection to Heal from Borderline Personality Disorder. This is the first book for the general public about mentalization-based treatment. Here it is. If you have been listening to my podcast or you are working with me, have worked with me, then you know how much I love mentalization. I talk about it so often, and it is a joy to have you, Bob, so that you, who are such a key player here in the work of mentalization and in the treatment being rolled out to the general public and the personality disorder population, to be here and explain and speak to us. So could you just start out with answering the question, what is mentalizing?
Yeah, well, that's a good place to start. But also, I just want to say I'm excited to be here because I really love your show. But also, not everybody knows about mentalization and stuff like that. So the fact that you are sort of interested in it and sort of like, see its utility, I think makes me also more excited to get to talk with you more about it. So yeah, mentalization, it's a kind of a fancy term for something that like we all do and kind of do all the time. It's the ability to accurately read, access, and reflect on mental states in ourselves as well as other people. And mental states really just kind of like all the invisible stuff of the mind. So thoughts, emotions, desires, attitudes, the stuff that we can't like quite see, but we all make assumptions about. And it applies both to self and other. I think a lot of times when people hear about mentalizing, they think it's just about reading other people, but it's also about reading ourselves and sort of being in touch with ourselves, understanding what we're feeling, actually connecting to what we're feeling. And it applies to other people as well, as being able to kind of understand what other people are going through, but also like caring about that and being able to empathize with others and actually being motivated by other people at an emotional level. So it kind of encompasses like all those things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful. That's how I know it to be sort of useful in my life and in my work. And that's a big one, right? It's knowing and caring. So it's holding your mind and someone else's mind in mind, essentially. So tell us, why is mentalization based treatment important for borderline personality disorder? Why would someone with BPD want to sort of look outside of DBT and then get involved in MBT?
Yeah, well, in some ways, like sort of when MBT was developed, the developers, Peter Fonagy, Anthony Bateman, they really offered like a mentalization-based understanding of the symptoms of borderline personality disorder. And really the idea there is that folks with borderline personality disorder, as sort of, we all know, have the ability to mentalize often quite well and quite accurately, can be very sensitive and attentive to kind of other people's mental states. And there can be challenges with mentalizing under like two main conditions. And that's the idea that in any scenario of like basically rejection, criticism, or abandonment, it can be really, really hard to mentalize, or in the context of any intense emotion. Is it's just, and that really goes for all of us, you know, where just like whenever we're in the context of a really intense emotion, it's just harder for us to think. But for folks with BPD, it can really really disrupt things such that the person, you know, can struggle to be in touch with what they're feeling. They can get even confused about what they're feeling. They can know that something's wrong, but not quite know why, you know, like what's actually causing me to kind of experience these difficult emotions. It can be hard to understand that. But also, there can be things can shut down in the form of what we call psychic equivalence mode, which essentially is certainty. So they sort of like in that state of certainty, the person doesn't really think that they're having an assumption. They feel like it's a fact. Like it's not that I'm assuming that I'm a bad person. It's like, no, I am bad. I am unlovable. And there's no space between like sort of the person and their thoughts. And, you know, under those conditions, things can get really, really overwhelming, really, really scary. And it's under those conditions that the person can then want to hurt themselves. There can be some certainty. I need to, because I'm so bad, I don't deserve to live. So really that's kind of what MBT is proposing, that all of these are really problems in mentalizing, and they lead to a lot of the functional challenges that we see in BPD.
Absolutely. It's relatable, I think, on so many levels, even just me sitting here personally, because we have that, big emotional wave, or I always say a tsunami, right? And in that space, that's when we have the activation of those attachment strategies that people usually engage in. So it's, whatever it is, depending on their childhood trauma or environment that they were in, they would sort of use one of those behaviors. And I know for myself, the reason why mentalization was so key, and I didn't know what it was at the time. Actually, I had a corrective relationship, and I didn't even know he was a corrective relationship until after, who is my husband now. And so in that corrective relationship, he would help keep me online, essentially. And so I had lost perspective in those spaces. I wasn't able to put myself in other people's shoes. And so I just found it was so valuable when you pair that with the emotion regulation tools, and you're pairing that with some of the other treatments that we know are sort of effective for the diagnosis. So that's very well said. So help us understand.
Rose, okay, because I just want to say that I was really struck by this, and you made reference to your own story, but I was listening to your story in preparation for the episode, and I was like blown away by your journey, but specifically of how much mentalizing there was in it. And really just the idea that like, is it fair? Because some of this trajectory, like you weren't in like a structured treatment, but all the stuff you talk about with like doing your own research and listening to podcasts and all that stuff, it was like a mentalizing engine that you were doing. And I was really actually inspired by it, that you were sort of pursuing it yourself in a way that really matches a lot of what we do in MBT.
Absolutely. Yes, that is accurate. I did not know what it was. I didn't know about mentalization at the time. I wasn't in any structured program. I had been in a doctoral program for psychology and had a master's degree by default from that. And I had been through so much therapy. And to be fair, so not understanding mentalizing, going through therapy, I wasn't receiving what was being offered. And I think years ago, I would have said, oh, my therapists were terrible, all the things. But the reality is I was dysregulated, and I wasn't able to think about the big picture, nor did I have a good sense. And you know what? You said earlier, like people with BPD are good at mentalizing. I would say for myself and many of the people that I work with, not always good at mentalizing, even in calm states. I think it depends, on the individual, but I personally wasn't great at perspective taking. And so I would just sort of railroad over, people. And so I had this idea in my head at the time where you're hearing these stories of me on the podcast that a therapy doesn't work, which is silly because I'm a therapist, right? At the time I was a clinician as well. And so when I met my now husband, which he also has a story he put on the podcast, it's a very fascinating journey we both had. he was much more, he's a very empathetic man. And so when I would have these episodes, he would have me do things that were uncomfortable, like make eye contact with me. He would like squat down on the ground. And so having to make eye contact when you're in those spaces is actually really valuable because
Okay.
you're reconnecting with the human aspect of the person. So when you're splitting,
Mm,
there's that sort of dehumanizing
oh,
going into
interesting.
that non-mentalizing mode, right? Yeah.
Interesting. So
So
maybe he was sort of approaching the interaction in quite a almost like kind of forcing, like, or like encouraging mentalizing in a way.
that's exactly right. He would tell me his perspective. He would define his intentions and his motives, and he would tell me what was in his mind, which really blew my mind. Once I became regulated again, I
Mm,
would I had all of this confusion in my mind of what was real. And so I started on a journey to find that out. And that's where we have all the podcasts. I started to try to figure out how I was so good clinically. And I could argue that I probably wasn't. I was probably doing a lot of mirroring and masking. But at the time,
okay.
I thought I was good clinically and I could understand people to this degree that were removed from me. But I just couldn't understand my son, my
Mm,
husband,
mm-hmm.
my family, and I couldn't take their perspective in any sort of continuous way. And that was my journey to try to learn how does one take perspective. And
Yeah.
I did this, in this sort of, outside of the therapy realm. And when I started to get more understanding and more knowledge and calm and had more individuation, less
Mm,
fragmentation,
mm-hmm.
that's when I stumbled upon MBT formally, which is fascinating. So hopefully that's helpful for you.
It
Yeah.
totally is helpful. Yeah. And it's sort of like this idea of like, that it's in one of the sort of ideas that's sort of implicit in or kind of explicit in MBT's theory of these sorts of challenges is that in relationships that are closest, where the attachment is so intense,
Mm.
it's much harder to think. So it makes complete sense to me that, like all of us in our closest relationships, this is where we can do it very well in some areas, but in the areas where things are a little more vulnerable, it can be just so much more challenging to do.
Oh, 100%. I think that hyperactive amygdala, and we're looking at sort of the hypoactive prefrontal cortex, is something that I was battling, right? I was a very impulsive person. So, even like with my son, and this is where mentalization is huge, but with my
Mm,
son, he was a little guy. He was about 3 when I met my husband, and
okay.
I was a single parent, and so there's this funny, we tell it as a funny story now, but, he's 3 and he had, brushed his teeth, getting ready for bed and everything, and then he opens the refrigerator. My husband, boyfriend at the time, is watching this all play out, and he
Mm,
takes whipped cream, and he's, like, pouring in his mouth and, like, chocolate syrup, right? And I'm like, "What?" Really
really?
not comprehending
Yeah.
how these types of behaviors would impact the development of a 3-year-old.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's things, and I wasn't dysregulated, but it's things like that where these
Mm,
constant conversations with Jay, my husband, he would, say, "Hey, perhaps this doesn't set him up to succeed because now he's got a sugar rush, so he's going to have a hard time laying down." And then there were
mm,
all, so it's, things like that that made it so valuable to me, both when dysregulated and then also regulated, to
mhm.
just see, hey, think of other people
Yeah,
and have a more flexible way of viewing the world. And that skill over time has been, I mean, it's life-changing. Absolutely life-changing, yeah.
that's great. That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, so well, thank you for letting me share a little bit about that. Why
Yeah,
don't you
no.
help us understand that you said mentalizing is something everyone does. So what is mentalization-based treatment? What does it
Mm.
entail? How is it different from DBT?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like DBT, as folks probably know, is a very kind of like skills-based therapy. So there's a lot of content to it. The therapist is sort of in a role, somewhat of a teacher or coach, sort of like there can be, and not everybody is sort of not all clinicians are like this, but there can be something of like a differential in sort of the coach model, right? It's like I'm showing you how to do things. That's one of the biggest differences between like MBT and DBT. It's probably a little more like what we call like egalitarian, where it's not, and even when you're talking about Jay, his language there, perhaps have you considered, right? There's a humility in that, right?
Yes.
It's just
Yes.
sort of like, I'm just sharing my mind. Consider my mind. It's not that my mind is better than your mind, but can you consider this, right? That kind of is a big part of MBT's therapeutic stance. Another part of it is what's called the not knowing stance, which is really that, like, as therapists, like, we've obviously, been trained and we sort of have a sense of what, steps we can take to help improve our patients' lives. But ultimately, none of us is sort of like, the god of mental states. None of us knows definitively what another person is feeling, or even what we're feeling. We can have a sense of it, but it's not like we can kind of see with a crystal ball into our own experience. So that's a huge part of MBT, is the therapist really just trying to be curious and be humble, and to kind of like ask questions rather than kind of telling patients what's going on with them. So that's a bit like the therapeutic stance of MBT. And in terms of like the structure of it, it is actually a structured treatment. So it's not just sort of the therapist asking questions all the time. We start the treatment by, just like you would in any treatment, like in terms of getting a sense of what brings the person in, what are their goals, what do they want to work in, where have they been struggling. We do explicitly give the diagnosis. So if the person has borderline personality disorder, we'll talk about that. If the person has narcissistic personality disorder, we'll talk about that, which you had heard your recent podcast or episode on narcissism, which I thought was really, really wonderful. So I know you're thinking about that as well. And but then what we do is we really work collaboratively with the patient to build what we call an MBT formulation. Which that's really where it's a document, it's written down, that kind of itemizes where does the person's ability to reflect break down.
Yeah.
And we put it in writing, we do it with the patient, we kind of get feedback, we revise together, and really that becomes the treatment plan of MBT, where we really kind of systematically work on the formulation to really help folks begin to reflect in areas where otherwise things would start to unravel. And so in that sense, there's a structure to it, but it's really tailored to the individual. And what we have in the formulation is all these problems in mentalizing, and there's just a bunch of strategies that MBT has for how do we treat each of them. Yeah. So if a person is they're confused about what they're feeling, we're going to go about helping them in a particular way. If they are struggling with a lot of certainty, like I'm right, other people are wrong, we're going to go about treating that in another way. If there are problems in empathy, we kind of go about helping folks with that in a whole nother way. So it's kind of tailored to the individual, but for each problem in mentalizing, there are kind of specific strategies, which is why I wrote the book, because it's kind of like, hopefully, if the book kind of goes through for each of these challenges, what are the different strategies?
Absolutely. That's wonderful. And I love what you said about the skills-based model versus the sort of collaboration. I think collaboration is very important for individuals with borderline personality disorder. I know we are a sensitive bunch. I always say that. And so to have a relatable sort of lived experience, or even just a collaboration where it's us together working on, hey, what breaks down? That's just so key. Just question for you, and I'm wondering if maybe my audience has the same question. If someone has a difficult time mentalizing, or as I mentioned earlier, and I know this isn't true for everyone, so for everyone listening who doesn't experience this, forgive me. But for myself and for many of the people that I work with, there is this sort of developmental delay. I reference it a lot on the podcast, just being younger and remembering not knowing how to think big picture as a child and not knowing how to take perspective as a child, regardless of sort of the environment and the trauma, that kind of thing. So when you have someone who comes in with mentalization and sort of is in this collaborative mapping out what some of the weaknesses are, what do you do, or what are some tools or tips you can give to the audience about their level of self-awareness? How do you help someone who doesn't know what their deficits are?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. Like, yeah, because but by definition, you're right. Like a deficit, we often kind of don't know where we're struggling. We don't know what we don't know. So kind of like, how do we kind of begin to map that out?
Mhm.
That's a good question. I mean, in some ways, that's why that's why I'm excited. And that's actually was one of the big, one of the big sort of pieces of impetus to like kind of like to write the book is because there's been nothing written for patients about how to actually identifying their own mentalizing vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's good.
And
Mhm.
so part of it, so really what the book has is these worksheets where you literally, it kind of guides you through where can you struggle. And even something as basic as like, what emotions do you find it hard to find in yourself?
Mhm.
Right? You can't just ask somebody that because somebody who doesn't know what emotions they're missing, they go, I don't know. Right? So there's a
Yeah.
list. There's literally a list. And then when you see the list, and that seems like it's a very simple thing, but like when you see the list, it's like, wow, I guess like it's true. Like I don't really, find sadness as easily in myself, especially if I'm feeling angry.
Right.
It feels like it's just anger and I can miss the sadness. Or, like it might be certain desires, like desire for attention or care. So, what I try to do in the book is to actually outline the different sorts of the shape that these challenges will take so that people can literally just look at it, hopefully, like identify with some of the things. And it gives a little bit of a roadmap where really we didn't have one before.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Something I really love about the book is the certainty toolkit.
Oh,
Um,
cool. Yeah.
yeah, that sort of continuum of how certain are you that
Hmm.
this person feels this way, right? And it was a wonderful set, of just kind of laying out how to think through the perspective that you have and maybe how are there other differing perspectives. Because as a clinician or a coach, I can talk people through that. But for them to be able to go to the workbook when they're in between sessions or just on their own as a public resource, that's a really wonderful thing for sure.
Well, thanks. And regarding the certainty piece, that's another thing because, like, you'll ask, folks like, "Oh, where do you struggle with certainty?" And folks will be like, "I don't know." Like, they're not quite sure, right? So it can be helpful to have literally just a list of the categories of certainty, right? Like,
Yes.
and for example, like certainty that about what other people are thinking or feeling,
Mm-hmm.
certainty that another person has done something wrong,
Yeah. Yeah.
certainty that I'm bad or not good enough, certainty that I have certain characteristics, that I
Yeah.
have certain qualities, right? So just kind of giving a bit of a packaging of it, then it's like, oh wow, I do. Patients will hear that. They're like, I guess that's true. I do think that I'm not smart enough.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then just sort of, and then they can fill it in. And then we will use that to actually structure the treatment so that the next time they're taking a test and they're having this conviction, no, I don't know enough. It's like, is that related to that form of certainty that you were talking about, where it feels so true
Mm-hmm.
that like your mind doesn't work the way that it should? Can we look at that a little bit?
Yeah. 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 That's great. Yeah. I think it's good to have this sort of resource for people to go and be able to explore that on their own because it is just that, right? It's an exploration because oftentimes without that self-awareness, I mean, in one of the worksheets I use, there's a sort of a diagram and it says like there are things that I know about myself
Mm,
that you also know. There are things that you know about me that I don't know,
mm,
that's blind spot. So if there are things that you know about me or other people know about me that I don't know, I'm going to want to know that, but I need help and exploration because as a clinician, you might go, well, I don't know this person. So we together have to sort of feel our way in the dark and work on what possibly could be some of those skill areas that need help. But with the book, I think it allows people in the middle, in between sessions, to really look through and start to think for themselves, to have that blind spot exposed.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. What you're describing, it's like sort of perspective taking, kind of like 101 in a way. Like, I love that is pure mentalizing that. Did you make that worksheet? The one you're talking about, like, what do you know about me? Like, that I don't, what do you know about me that I don't know? Or,
Oh, no, no, no. Goodness, that's so wonderful that you said that. No, that was actually a resource I got from taking the certification of the training on mentalization
oh,
at
cool.
McLean.
Oh, we did
Yeah.
that? Okay, all right.
Yeah, you guys
I'm
did
like, that's
that.
really good. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a super wonderful. I reference that often because there are just so many things I think for me in my own journey that I just never thought of
Mhm.
because I spent so much time, and I think this is relatable for the audience, right? I just spent so much time thinking about how I felt, feeling basically, not
Yeah.
thinking, but I spent so much time feeling, right? I felt, I
Right.
created a narrative, I engaged in an action urge, and
Mm,
then I just created a world for myself where I didn't have close connections. And then I looked around and I thought, why did I do that? And so perspective taking,
mm.
huge, definitely huge. And so the workbook, again, that's why I think it's so valuable, and I'm glad you're here. And I think everyone should check it out because the workbook gives everyone. And first of all, if I had $1 for every time someone asked me for a different workbook other than a DBT workbook, is there any
Right.
other workbook you can recommend? Not that DBT isn't valuable, but I think that mentalization calls out a
Mm.
micro of DBT and makes it sort of a macro that can be picked apart. Would you think?
Absolutely. No. And there is some stuff in DBT about sort of, well, actually all the stuff about mindfulness of current emotion, right?
Yeah.
That's mentalizing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
No, but I really, I think what you're saying is I want to kind of underscore it because you say I spent so much time feeling,
Mm.
or as you are also saying, thinking about my feelings. Like, I wonder too, I just want to kind of just underscore this for your listeners is that sometimes when we introduce the concept of mentalizing, it can kind of get mixed up with other sorts of concepts. So, for example, mentalizing is not ruminating or obsessing about what other people think about us.
That's right. Yep.
Right? That
Yep.
is not, that wouldn't, right? Because the people, because I could imagine your listeners being like, well, I do that all the time and it causes me so much pain.
Right. No,
Right?
not rumination. That's
Yeah,
right.
right. And so because often when we're in that spot of like I'm sort of like ruminating, worrying about what others think about me, like
Mhm.
that's like anti-mentalizing. Usually there's a lot of certainty in there, which is certainty that I need you to feel a certain way about me in order for me to be okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And so that's sort of like, and that's a very, very tenuous spot to be in, that sort of all of one's well being resides in the mind of another. There's actually not enough self in that,
That's right.
So I love that point. But then the other one that you said is like, I just spent so much of my time feeling.
Mm.
That's also not mentalizing, right? Because it's just like, it's almost affect without reflection.
Yes, that's it.
So
Yes.
then we're going to want to, okay, can we, there's this idea in MBT that's called mentalized affectivity,
Mhm.
which is can I be in the emotion while also reflecting on the emotion? And that's really when folks are able to kind of have that, and there's a lot of research on that, we start to see just significantly improved emotional stability.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't sort of take over anymore. It's that place where you're like, "Wow, I'm feeling this way. Okay, and I can respond this way." And so that space that I talk about a lot, in between your action, the stimulus and the environment, and your action, it really is there, and it allows for a lot of freedom. I've seen a lot of people get well, and myself
Mhm.
included. I was able to really do things now that I'd never thought I could do before. I can think through how my behavior impacts other people. So that's an important distinction that you make because I think when we're ruminating,
Mm.
we might think we're thinking of the other person. And I know for myself, mentalization is something that there were so many years that I don't even think I could have. It's just like, whoo, because
Mm.
I thought I took good perspective. If you would have asked me,
Right.
about certain things because of that that rigidity, that psychic equivalence, right? And so
Mhm.
I thought, well, yeah, of course I'm a great perspective taker, right? I'm the most empathetic person that you'll ever meet. And
Right.
it's good that you make that distinction, because I think the realization is we're not mentalizing unless we can hold our mind, our emotion, our history and experiences, and then the other person's emotion, mind, history, and experiences in our mind at the same time. And
Mm.
take perspective, maybe, can I say that simply? Take perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, no, that's the key idea, is that oftentimes it's sort of like, it's like, this is maybe overly simplistic, but there can be moments where it's too much of the other person, right? It's too much of their mind. Their mind controls, my mind,
Right.
versus other times where it's all my mind and not enough space for others. So I totally appreciate that. Like, that is mentalizing. We're in ourselves, reflecting on ourselves with the other, reflecting on the other at the same moment.
Yes, exactly. Yes, it's a beautiful thing. So my audience, perhaps you guys are thinking, I don't know how I could ever do that. Maybe I still don't quite understand. If you still don't quite understand, we understand, Bob and I. So what you can do, I would definitely recommend checking out the worksheets. Bob has been generous to allow us a link that I'll put in the show notes that links to all of the free resources that you can have to even just try it out before you jump in and get started. You can always reach out for help and support as well. And if you are worried that perhaps you're not going to get here, which a lot of the questions I have are around empathy. So I thought maybe we can dive into some of
Cool.
the sort of context dependent or global empathic deficits that
Oh,
come
yeah.
along. Yeah. So I think, one of the biggest things people will say is like, okay, well, now I know what that other person is thinking and feeling. But Rose, I don't care. What
I
do I
love
do? Because I want to care. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, definitely. That was another thing. I don't want to keep like, I hope, just sort of like just complimenting you sort of in your sort of what you've sort of shared on the podcast. But I have to say that was another thing I was really, really impressed by, is how important, and that you talking about this in your own recovery, how important developing the capacity for empathy was. Because that's not something that I hear folks talk about very much, actually.
It
But
is.
like, it was like you put that in like pride of place when you talk about your recovery. So I just want to say I really, really appreciate that. And the idea in MBT is it can almost like is that in general, if there's a problem with empathy, if we sort of can't fully enter into or sort of be motivated by another's experience, there's also a way in which we're not fully actually grounded in ourselves. So our whole idea in MBT is that it's not like a us versus them sort of thing. It's that through connecting to myself in a real way, like when I'm really connected to myself, I'm able to consider the other. And if I'm really able to kind of consider the other, I'm actually finding a window into myself. So we
Wonderful.
don't see these things as mutually exclusive. So in terms of sort of, addressing the sort of problems in empathy, the first step I would say is getting a sense of what are they? Right? What are the problems in empathy? And so that's one of the things. I won't go through there are a bunch of worksheets in this in the book. I won't go through them all, but one of them that I talk about is what we call person specific problems in empathy,
Mm-hmm.
which is that all of us have those people, the people that we can be full, it's really a lot harder for us to enter into their perspective. So can starting to kind of put words on that, what are the people where I can sort of struggle to enter into their experience? It also could be, are there groups of people? Maybe it's people from a political party, or maybe sort of, it could be people who belong to certain organizations or something like that, and sort of trying to kind of, put words on that.
Sure.
To what extent can my empathy be constrained by what I'm going through? So we
Mm-hmm.
could kind of emotion dependent empathic deficits, right? So that's sort of the start of it, is we got to get a sense, we got to make a roadmap. What
Mm-hmm.
are our core vulnerabilities? And so we do that in a formulation and sort of the worksheets, you kind of like itemizing what are they. And so yeah, I guess there's the whole stuff about strategies, which I could talk about the strategies, but Any thoughts about that, Rose, in terms of the importance of recognizing one's own empathic vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I love that. I love that you brought that up. I have one question before I speak to that. You talked about being connected to the self. So
Yeah.
could you define what it means through the lens of MBT of someone being connected to themselves?
Oh gosh, it's such a great question. All right, let me think about this. So, this is maybe good moment to kind of define some of the kind of like the almost the trajectory of mentalizing that we're thinking about in MBT. And really, we define it in terms of three things, which I think will help to answer your question. It's the what, the
Mm,
why, and the how. And so, what does it mean to be connected to the self? We can use this sort of formulary here. First, we got to know, what are we feeling? What emotions are we experiencing? We also got to get a sense of our desires. What do we want? Um, and then also, how do we feel about ourselves? Are we in a state of confidence? Are we a state of insecurity? Is there shame there, right? So the what mentalizing is kind of like the foundation of all mentalizing.
yes.
And it's like what you were talking about, that sort of like at the start of treatment, a lot of folks can feel very confused about what's even going on with them.
Yeah.
So the start of MBT is where we're really helping people with that.
Okay.
But then we've got to broaden it. We got to get to the why. What is this about? You
Mhm.
know? And the why could be about circumstances that are affecting how we feel. It also could be about, maybe I engage in these behaviors that actually lead me to feel bad.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? So that's another piece, is actually getting a sense of the why. Then the other piece, though, how do we get connected to ourselves? We actually have to get a sense of the validity of our experience.
Mm,
So a lot of folks with BPD, they just don't feel like their experience is valid. And so it's really hard to access an emotion that you're criticizing yourself for having.
mhm. Yeah.
So that's sort of another piece, is how is it valid that I'm feeling a certain way? How is it reasonable? And then finally, there's this sort of the how piece, which is that you can know you're feeling anxious, but
Mm,
not be actually in it.
right. Yeah.
So that's sort of almost the sort of the additional piece to get connected to the self, is kind of moving from the head to the heart.
Yeah.
And I feel like this happens in therapy a lot, which is a lot of folks are so insightful, so thoughtful. They've done a lot of therapy. They could share a lot of their insights about what their challenges are, but they're not fully connected to themselves.
Mm,
So in MBT, they call this, this is maybe an unfortunate name, but like pretend mode,
yeah.
where the person's kind of in their head, but not
Yes.
fully in their experience. So
Mm,
that's where we got to help people actually kind of get in their bodies, get in their kind of get connected to their emotions more. So I would say those are the kind of parts of what it means to be connected to yourself, is to know what you're feeling, why you're feeling it, and to actually inhabit it in a way.
that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. That's been my experience as well. So I appreciate that. I like that you touched on that shame bit, and sort of that connection, because I think shame becomes a big obstacle for many people and with mentalization or empathy, right? Or sort of, these different things that we're talking about. Because if you're carrying shame, it is difficult, I think, to sort of quote unquote care about someone else. But really, like you said, to be connected to yourself enough to have mentalizing come back online, and then to understand how to hold all of those pieces and to connect. So maybe you could just it seems like a good segue to spend some time talking about the unstable sense of self
Mm.
through the lens of mentalization, and maybe where people can begin in your book as well. So two questions. We'll start with the self.
Yeah, working on sort of unstable sense of self. Well,
Hmm.
the start of that is going to have to be when sort of it gets, this is sort of the idea of identity diffusion in BPD. And I guess I'll throw this out there. One of the big distinctions, it actually relates to your last question, is there an actual kind of almost a shifting sense of self or an unstable identity. You know, people will talk about this, I think, in like, you know, the BPD kind of like discourse world, or like chameleoning or something like that. So is there an actual, a kind of, it's too much tailoring of oneself to others?
Mm.
In which case we do actually need to work on helping the person really identify what they're feeling, do all the stuff that I just mentioned, right?
Yeah.
There's sometimes though where the unstable sense of self, it's actually more of like a devaluation of the self,
Right. That's right.
right? I'm
Mhm.
bad. I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
And that, to be honest, that's actually requires a different set of strategies
Mhm.
actually. So that's really we have to do that. It's almost one of the most important things that we do with people at the start of treatment, is trying to get at, okay, if you're really judging yourself, if there's a lot of self-hatred, what is its basis?
Yeah.
What's your argument? Like, what do you think makes you bad?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
a lot of times it's, I guess I would say it can kind of fall into a couple categories. One is there's a way in which for some people, how they feel about themselves is very determined by how other people feel about them.
Mhm.
There's this certainty, my worth depends on how you see me.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then other folks, it's a little more, it relates to the stuff you were just talking about related to narcissism in a previous episode, where it kind of could be, well, I haven't achieved enough in my life. I don't have a good enough career. I don't
Mhm.
look a certain way. There's a way in which self-worth can get based on these external things. So what we got to do in MBT is we got to kind of put words on it. So can you really define what are you basing your self-worth on?
Mhm.
But then begin to actually do perspective taking around that sort of sense of self-worth.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and one example of it might be, let's say somebody is quite certain that, well, I need a relationship in order to feel okay. So then you'll sort of be curious, okay, so let's say you got that relationship. Do you really, is your sense that it would actually, you would feel, have a very solid sense of self-esteem?
Mm.
Well, no, definitely not. I've always kind of hated myself, even when I was in relationships. So then we got to start to question sort of some of these ideas that they're of what people are basing their self-worth on.
Mhm.
And that sort of, this is part of what's sort of in the book, is can you try to imagine having a sense of self-worth even if you weren't in a relationship?
Mhm.
And then the patient will respond, say, no, I can't imagine it. Would you be willing to try? Okay, let me try.
Mm.
In the act of trying to do perspective taking around our forms of certainty, over
Mhm.
time, I don't know how to describe it, but people start to change.
Yeah.
You know, they start to like themselves more. It's not like suddenly they're like, they have a, you know, perfectly solid sense of self, but they feel a little less convinced of their badness.
Mm.
And
Yes.
then we start to see this sort of improvement as treatment unfolds.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I laughed a little bit there because I feel like that's was my experience. It's like all of a sudden, and in earlier, it's been about 7 years, maybe it's 6 or 7 years for the podcast. So when I was younger in the earlier episodes, I didn't have the same, it takes time, right? Growth is, takes time to grow. And so back then I would have, these sort of moments where I was learning to take perspective, and I would say, oh, there's this gray space in my brain. Like, I just don't understand. I feel like there's just
Hmm.
like, right. And now come to know all the research about sort of neurons and how they connect, and we can create
Mm.
new experiences, and then just learning perspective taking. And then all of a sudden, it becomes sort of automatic. It's a beautiful thing. I've had
Yeah.
people, kind of work through vignettes, reading different stories to try to take perspective in a story. So that
Nice.
I don't know if that's something that, yeah.
Well, I love to, I actually have a feeling it's very relevant, but what's an example of that? What does that look like?
So, I always come from this lens of like, when did I learn this and then didn't absorb it? Because
Mm.
we've had really, pretty decent schooling, I would say, and it's inclusive. Even years ago, I'm 43. And so I went back to the time in English class where you were
Mm.
reading different stories to take perspective, to learn about character development, to learn about different characters of people and moral values and moral
Mhm.
development. And so I will take like vignettes of stories from that time period that were designed in English class for
Cool.
teenagers
Yeah.
to try to figure out the different characters, what they were thinking, what they were feeling, how to hold their emotions in their mind. In the event that someone isn't willing to, or not able, willing,
Love it.
combination of those things, or
Yeah.
has that sort of shame, when they don't want to do the imaginational sort of work, or imagining
Love
or
it.
trying to take perspective of something sort of external, and then bringing that closer
Yes.
and closer and closer, and then doing that mapping. It seems to really work, and you see it start to click when people are like, oh my gosh, I wasn't able to take perspective of the people in this story. They become fascinated by their brain's ability to learn, and then they want to do
Love
it in
it.
their everyday life. Yeah.
That I think is very, very consistent. And this is something it's a version of what I read about in the book that's called export your own situation. So
Mhm.
sometimes when it's really hard to kind of take a different perspective on our own experience, we got to export it.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
like consider it in the experience of the other. That actually makes it easier to think, right? Because we're less charged emotionally when we're considering another person's experience.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then we look at it out there, and then as
Mm.
you're describing, we're gradually bring it in here.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so tell us as we wrap up here, I have two more questions for you. What is a success story with MBT? What do you think sort of the end result is for people out there to give them hope?
Great. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, if you, I mean, would you want, I can give like, it's just completely de-identified, but like tell you a little bit about like a particular patient that we wrote about it, or I wrote about in the book. Is that okay?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, okay, cool. So, well, this is a patient who essentially presented to treatment maybe in their like early or in her early 30s, and really struggled with like a lot of self-injury, like a lot of like burning, some cutting, a lot of kind of suicidality, like, would do like sort of quite impulsive actions of just sort of like stepping out in the street, kind of like hoping that they would just get hit by a car, or that she would get hit by a car. And also really sort of engaging in like kind of risky promiscuous sex with sort of strangers. And so a lot of like tremendous self-loathing, um really, just really really hating herself. She was a paraprofessional, so she worked in like a school, but she felt like she wasn't smart enough, that she had never really had like a long-term relationship. So she thought, all she was worth was sort of like to be used as an object for men. And that she never would really be able to have the life that she wanted, which was like a family, and also just sort of like, basically being a teacher, not just being a paraprofessional, but like having her own classroom.
Mhm.
And so like tremendous self-loathing, but also just a lot of doubt about just like her own abilities, and a really kind of negative view about those abilities. So yeah, so she came to us in that spot, quite compromised, very isolated. But she came, I think I met her and she was applying to the Gunderson outpatient program at McLean. That's a program that I work in, where it's like a day treatment program where folks do the kind of like the evidence-based therapy groups for borderline like during the day, but then also we help them, they sort of start working and stuff like that. So it's like kind of very like recovery-based model of BPD and other personality disorders. So she kind of started doing MBT with me in that program, and really we sort of started, I gave the diagnosis of sort of borderline personality disorder. There were some narcissistic traits, so we talked about those as well. A lot of conditional self-worth, basing self-worth on external things. And really kind of doing all the early phases of the treatment that I talked about earlier, like giving the diagnosis, developing a formulation, crisis planning. That's like actually a huge part of MBT as well, which I haven't mentioned, like developing a crisis plan. So how do you begin to kind of mentalize and kind of think in moments where you want to be drawn towards these challenging, maladaptive behaviors?
Yeah.
So yeah, but in terms of like the treatment, really that was sort of the beginning of sort of like when she would come in and want to, and describe these moments of wanting to engage in self-injury due to all of this self-loathing, trying to kind of understand, like, can we help, helping her to put words on her feelings, but also broaden it. Because
Right.
because a lot of times what was happening is like self-loathing is also itself a bit of a mask. There's often other emotions in play. And so she started to kind of notice that there were often, like when she was criticizing herself or being quite mean to herself, there was a desire for connectedness, there was a desire for care. And it was almost easier for her to talk meanly to herself than to actually feel the wish for something different than what she had.
Right, to
So,
receive that. Yeah, okay.
yeah. And so, but the thing is to be able to recognize that the picture started to get broader,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
the, the desires to self-injure, they didn't completely go away, but they started to recede.
Mm-hmm.
Because she was more connected to herself. And that's our model in MBT, is that oftentimes when a person has lost themselves in a way, they can almost self-injure to kind of, get themselves back or bring their mind back online.
Yeah.
So self-injury began to improve, and then started really kind of working in earnest to really look at these assumptions that she wasn't good enough, that she would never be able to succeed. And a version of what you're talking about doing with your patient, like, like, how does she see other paraprofessionals at her job, right? So kind of considering like sort of the, looking at it outside the self at first.
Yes.
But then also just curious, sort of starting to look at, how did other people see her?
Mm.
Like, where do you think that everybody else would agree that you could never go to graduate school and that you'd never be able to succeed? Oh no, they wouldn't say that, but they don't know the real me. It's like, can we consider though their perspectives and what leads them to see you in this way that's so different from how you see yourself?
Mm-hmm.
And sort of like, progressively as we began to do that, there started to be kind of cracks in the kind of like sharp, like cracks in this armor of self-hatred. Things just started to soften up. She started, rather than just being mean to herself, she started to cry more and to kind of be open to feeling broader feelings and experiencing a sense of hope. Like, I actually would like to really move my life forward and kind of change my life. The self-injury started falling away. The risky sex started falling away. And, she said, well, I guess I can try it. I know I won't be good enough, but I can try applying to grad school. And then she ultimately, applied to grad school, got in, proceeded to get straight A's, and really, just sort of ended up like really moving herself forward in her life, dating again, recognizing her wish for an actual relationship with somebody who would love and respect her rather than just treat her like an object. And then ultimately like sort of like pursuing that in earnest. So at this point, she's been in recovery for, I don't know, probably like 4 or 5 years of no longer meeting criteria for BPD. She has a career, still working on the relationship stuff, but she's not settling for less, which I think is amazing.
It is.
And then sort of like, and all of these sort of behavioral challenges have just significantly receded, which is really what we think about in MBT, which is that if we can get mentalizing online, help folks like see themselves from a broader range of perspectives, that ultimately the behavioral stuff is going to kind of sort it out. And that is what the empirical research on MBT also shows.
Absolutely. That story was wonderful. I appreciate your sharing it. I know that there are so many people out there that will relate to that client's struggle or that individual struggle. And maybe now that they can sort of pick up your book and jump right in, there's this sort of softening and a letting go of the shame over time. When you can take perspective, the world becomes less confusing. And so you can move towards a place of a bit more order. And there's still work to be done. We're all growing. And so when you have work to do outside of your diagnosis, that's a good thing. I think it means you're alive. And so it sounds
Absolutely.
like, right, she's living, and that's wonderful. So I appreciate your coming on the show today. What I would love is that we are going to have you come back, because there's so
Oh,
many
cool.
things to talk about. So that would be great. We'll give people an opportunity to look at the worksheets and see if they have any questions. And then maybe we'll have you come on back and answer some of those questions. I think that you have some
Well, that'd
great.
be fun. I would love that. Yeah.
Wonderful. So just so you guys can get a visual of the book again, this is the book. You can get it on Amazon. We're going to post all of the links to how you can get in touch with Bob, and I'll post the link to the free worksheets in the comments as well, so that you can access us. And just so you know, you can always access me at 844-9-THRIVE or Rose at thriveonlinecounseling.com. Big plug for Mentalization. It is such a wonderful thing, and I don't want you to think what you're doing right now isn't enough. Well, this is an addition, and it's just something to add some variety, give you some new perspective, right?
Yeah.
To your life. So, Bob, anything else you wanted to say before we wrapped up for today?
No, I really just appreciate the work that you do, both as a clinician, as sort of like someone with lived experience, and sort of I learn a lot from your show, and I just love kind of how much you kind of embrace these sort of concepts in your own recovery, but also kind of like in bringing them to the kind of the broader world. So I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. All right, everybody. Well, you remember you're loved, you're worthy, you're here for a purpose, and I'll see you next time for another episode of From Borderline to Beautiful.
Yeah. I can't change the past when it's tomorrow. Yeah. Yeah. You can't change the past when it's tomorrow. Yeah. There was a time when the slate was clear. No sins or remorse piled up year by year. I was on the nice list. There wasn't a chance I'd miss. Maybe should have passed on chasing every wish. Now, knowing this, yeah. I climbed ladders and reached for a star, thinking the right number of dollars could take me so far. I had no idea I come to know who you are, the depth of the pain, the breadth of the scar. And here's the thing I still can't dismiss. Maybe I choose it again, even now, knowing this. I had my road cast, escaping the ghost from back in the past, chasing success so fast while my soul sat on a shelf. No wonder I struggle with my mental health. I had the vision, I had the plan, not realizing it would change who I am. Roadblocks, battles, seasons of sorrow, I brushed them off, they couldn't last till tomorrow. I didn't process, I didn't grieve, I didn't sit and let things be. I just kept moving, no time or stress. Should I have stopped now? Knowing this, yeah. Plug and play with all the things. After every mistake, I'd forget this thing, thinking nobody else could get me right. Every interaction triggered my fight or flight. In the chaos, I searched for peace, not realizing acceptance held the key. Starting with honesty, stillness, learning to sit things I ignored before knowing this. I think about the times and still get pissed. Wondering what I could have done now. Knowing this, the winds of change can knock you down, rip your reality straight from the ground. Would I follow the same road? Would I chase the bliss? Would I make the same choice now? Knowing this, the truth cuts deep, the lessons persist. Would I do it all again now? Knowing this. It's who you are when nobody's watching. The thoughts inside, I never forgot them. I rival you, sit and pout, but if you had them, would you speak them out? Or let them fester with all your doubt? What would you do now? Knowing this, living for the day I can use my 401k. That is not the way, I don't wanna work this hard anymore. Waiting to find peace, then die when I'm 74. Living in the now should be the life, not just surviving in the wash filled with strife. Went to the physician, yeah, and he said I was ill. Then he gave me a dose of mind-numbing pills. He said, listen, son, it's all the feelings that kill. Would I listen to that now? Knowing this, searching and searching for it. Whatever it is, every road I take, I never quite live in it. Not in a bottle, not in her pants, not in the temple or doing the tribal go reading. None of them revealed the meaning. Dopamine makes me a love machine. I've got no executive function, and that makes me mean. Addicted to the caffeine from the coffee bean. You might be concerned, but yo, I'm trying to function. So unpack all that, take it back to your luncheon. Yeah. Your buzzwords and assumptions. Yeah. You get over it, and it's nothings. Maybe wisdom's just collecting scars, learning who you are beneath the stars. Maybe peace was never something to chase. Maybe it was waiting in the empty space. Still, I wonder when I reminisce.